Welcome to episode number 10 of the Find Your Calling channel. In this episode, we'll be taking a look at how the commitments we make with our time can be influenced by our desire to receive validation for our self-worth. These commitments can become a source of unhealthy validation and distraction that can work against us in our quest to discover our own unique calling in life. Today, we'll be discussing a plan to address these obstacles. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Find Your Calling channel. At some points on your journey to find your calling, you may have felt that there were forces working against you, trying to prevent you from discovering whatever it is you're meant to do in life. In a real sense, you're right. Unfortunately, for many of us, one of these opposing forces looks back at us in the mirror every morning. That's right. You and I can help stymie our own efforts to find our true calling. One significant way we do this is through the decisions we make regarding the commitments in our lives. The truth is that many of these commitments we make to people, organizations, and activities are heavily influenced by our need to validate our identity. These commitments can, in turn, hinder us in two ways. First, the validation we receive from them, whether such validation is positive or negative, influences our perception and decision-making with regards to our calling. Secondly, these commitments can often serve to keep us so distracted and busy with life that we cannot achieve the level of inner stillness that's needed to discern our calling. Once these two hindrances are remedied and any lingering identity issues have been addressed, the remaining process of finding our true calling can then become an enjoyable experience. We discussed in the previous episode how a correct understanding of our identity is one of the keys to unlocking our true calling. We also looked at a number of examples of how we can misunderstand our calling or pursue a false calling when we allow our identity to be defined in ways other than what God intended. The unhealthy validation we receive from the various commitments in our lives is a major contributing factor to misunderstood identity. In this chapter, we're going to learn how to address unhealthy validation in a way that will allow God to correct our vision of ourselves and solidify our identity entirely in Him where it belongs. So what is unhealthy validation? It's important to note that the validation we receive in our lives is not necessarily unhealthy in and of itself. Often, it's the way we internalize the validation that makes it unhealthy. For instance, if we help teach a Sunday school class at church and we receive positive feedback from those who attend, and possibly from the pastor, this validation is not unhealthy in and of itself. But what if, in our heart of hearts, we believe we need to keep doing good works in order to earn God's love? We may never say it out loud. We may not even believe in our mind that it's true, but what if that's what we feel in our heart? If so, then the validation we receive from teaching the class can ultimately be unhealthy for us because the way we're processing it isn't healthy. We can be using it as proof that we've earned God's approval through our service. In this scenario, the affirmation we're receiving is actually serving as an anesthesia to mask our own misguided understanding of God's unconditional love. In essence, the validation is helping to reinforce an inaccurate and ultimately harmful view of our own identity. This can in turn be hindering our ability to discern our calling. Another example of unhealthy validation would be if a parent or significant mentor constantly reinforces a certain career path or vocation, telling you that it's either your duty or your purpose in life to pursue it. Your desire to please this person, combined with the constant reinforcement they provide in implying that your value and worth are tied to your pursuit of the path they are encouraging you to pursue, can be another powerful motivator. It can also be unhealthy validation which keeps you pursuing someone else's idea of what your calling should be, while simultaneously suppressing the true calling that was imprinted on your soul by your Creator. In his autobiography, Open, tennis star Andre Agassi describes his own experience with this phenomenon. For those who don't know, Andre Agassi is one of the greatest tennis players of all time. From the time he was old enough to hold a racket, he was groomed by his father to be the #1 tennis player in the world, a goal that young Andre knew wasn't his own. In fact, the opposite was true. Listen to how Andre describes the feeling he had when he was forced by his father to spend countless hours practicing tennis when he was only 7 years old. I hate tennis, hate it with all my heart, and I still keep playing, keep hitting all morning and all afternoon because I have no choice. No matter how much I want to stop, I don't. I keep begging myself to stop, and I keep playing. And this gap, this contradiction between what I want to do and what I actually do, feels like the core of my life. From Open, Chapter 1. Andre went on to spend decades of his life striving to achieve the dream his father had forced upon him. He earned millions of dollars doing it, but by his own admission, he hated the game that consumed his life for so many years. While this is a very clear example of unhealthy validation, of someone pushing their version of a life calling on someone else, there are a multitude of far more subtle examples in many of our lives. Unhealthy validation can often come from a loving parent who is, in their own mind, simply encouraging their child. If not accompanied with the instruction that we all need concerning how to discern our own unique calling, this encouragement can be just as destructive. Perhaps we look up to a parent and therefore aspire to their vocation, and they innocently encourage this, believing that to be our true desire. We can easily receive this validation as confirmation of our own value and worth, and then slip into the false belief that our value and worth are dependent upon pursuit of the same vocation as the beloved parent. Thus, we can begin our own journey pursuing a false calling that we believe to be our own. If we're ever to get free from this cycle of unhealthy validation, we must see it for what it is and face the truth. At the same time that you're addressing unhealthy validation in your life, you'll be creating an environment that is far less busy and distracted. This will allow you to better process the new thoughts and feelings that will arise as a result of the removal of unhealthy validation, as well as those unaddressed thoughts and feelings that have previously been buried under a mountain of commitments and busyness. Many of us constantly run around performing unnecessary and demanding tasks so that we can get validation from others instead of learning to receive God's eternal and persistent love for us. What we desperately need is to internalize the reality that God's love for us is immutable and independent of our performance. I refer to this process as disconnecting so you can re-engage. We temporarily disconnect from commitments and dial back on some relationships in order to clarify our identity and achieve the calmness needed to re-engage with our true value and purpose. The process will vary in length from person to person. Some people might be able to accomplish it in as little as 3 months. Others may find they need 6 months or a year or more to complete it. As you plan to implement this step, I would suggest you start by planning for a 6-month period and then adjust as needed. Don't get hung up on how long it takes, and don't try to rush it. Just understand that when all is said and done, you'll be equipped to discover your true calling. How to remove distractions and misleading validation. We all seek validation of our identity. It's a core need, yet most of us are completely unaware of how our pursuit of this validation affects the decisions we make. In order to clearly see how your own pursuit of validation is affecting your quest to find your calling, it's helpful, and I would even say necessary for most, to temporarily remove as many sources of unhealthy validation from your life as possible. But how do you identify the sources of misleading and unhealthy validation? The answer is that you probably aren't in a position to be able to clearly see all of the sources of unhealthy validation in your life until your identity is firmly and completely centered in God's unconditional love and acceptance. It's likely impossible for you to perceive all of the ways you are erroneously seeking or receiving unhealthy validation from other people, organizations, activities, and accomplishments. So how do you pinpoint the thing you can't see? To help solve this dilemma, consider the following analogy. Suppose you have a good relationship with a significant person in your life. They might be a close family member, a romantic interest, your spouse, or perhaps a friend. Now imagine that person has to go away suddenly for 6 months on a long trip, and they won't have the ability to communicate with you in any way until they return. No cell phone, no email, no video conferencing, not even a snail mail letter. Within the space of a week, you begin to have a sense of loss. You realize how much you actually rely on that person's advice, or perhaps how often you use them as a sounding board to help you think through life's challenges. As the weeks turn into months, the list of things you miss about this person grows. By the end of the 6-month period, you have a keen understanding of exactly what you miss about the relationship. You now realize things about the relationship that you would not have been able to quantify prior to this person's absence. In addressing the existence of unhealthy validation in our lives, we're going to use the same principle. If you temporarily pause many of your non-essential commitments and limit certain types of interactions for a space of time, you'll begin to have longings for the things you miss, and quite possibly a deeper level of peace and calmness because of some of the negative influences that are now absent. These feelings and emotions will help point you in the direction you need to examine further for potential unhealthy validation. It's important to understand that this isn't a plan which most people can implement overnight. It takes some planning and forethought. It's also important to understand that this isn't a bridge burning expedition. I'm not suggesting you neglect your familial responsibilities, quit your job, or cut off your friendships. This step is a means to an end. In order to find your true calling, you need to know the truth about yourself and why you do what you do. This process will help lead you to those answers. And once this step is completed, you can selectively add back into your life many of the things you removed, but with a healthier perspective. You'll likely discover some things that need to be gone for good as well, and that's okay too. To begin with, start making a list of all the commitments you have in your life. On your favorite electronic device or perhaps a sheet of paper, on the left-hand side, begin listing the names of people to whom you have some regular commitment. You'll possibly list your spouse or significant other, children, parents, friends, etc. Next, begin to list organizational commitments. Your job should be listed here along with your college or trade school, commitments at your local church, etc. Finally, add any other regular recreational or extracurricular commitments, as well as any other significant voluntary or involuntary commitments you have in your life that I may not have covered in the above description. Next, on the right-hand side of the page, begin to list the specifics of what you are committed to in each of these cases. Don't get caught up in the details of every single thing you're committed to, as in a family relationship with a spouse, for instance. Instead, limit yourself to identifying those things that are not essential, that take up more than an hour of your time in a given month, and that are long-term. If you're committed to going hiking once a month with your spouse, then put that down. However, you wouldn't list the fact that you're committed to being faithful to that relationship because that's an essential aspect. Instead, focus on the non-essential aspects of the relationship. For your job, which is likely an essential commitment, you'll only list things on the right-hand column if they are non-essential job-related activities. Do you volunteer every year to help organize the company picnic? Put that down. Are you working 60 hours a week, well over the required amount to remain employed? Put that down. It's important that you make a thorough list. If you help organize class birthday parties for your child's class at school, that will go on the list on the right across from the children category. Are you on the prayer team at church? That goes in the right-hand column across from church. Are you on a tennis team that requires regular practice and game time? Put that down on the right-hand column across from recreational commitments. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. In episode number 11, we'll take a look at an example commitment chart and discuss how you can use this information to take the next step in your journey to disconnect from distracting influences. Also, we'll begin to outline a process that will help solidify your God-given identity so you won't be pulled back into the same trap again as you move forward. As a reminder, you can subscribe to this channel to be notified when future episodes are released. If you want additional information on this topic, please consider picking up the 2 books I've written on this subject, Find Your Calling Without Losing Your Mind, and Overcome the Obstacles and Succeed at Your Calling. Purchase links for both books can be found in the show notes below. And finally, if you find the information in these programs helpful, please tell someone else about this channel. Thanks for watching, and may God bless your day.